In the modern world, people tend to see religion as an enemy, as a destructive force that keeps the masses kind of ignorant. I also had a totally negative view on religion until I started to explore shamanism. To my surprise, I found that my trips with substances like ayahuasca, iboga, and LSD actually seemed to confirm the validity of the mystical experience that religious texts have talked about through the ages. Tom Roberts argues that the revival of psychedelics is a second Reformation. Before the first Reformation, the Bible was only in Latin and only priests could read it. After Martin Luther, everyone could read the Word of God and they could learn about the visions of the prophets for themselves. When psychedelics became widely available in the 60s, many people were suddenly able to access the same kind of experiences that the prophets had had. They would have mystical visions, attain a sense of unity with the cosmos. They could even speak to spirits who introduce themselves as gods or angels. So the question is, could we evolve kind of a new religious structure that encompasses these new revelations? Or can a new expression of the religious impulse emerge in our time? Hey everybody, thank you for checking in with us. We're here for Mindshift, and today we're interviewing the extraordinary psychedelic visionary artist Alex Grey, whose work has become kind of emblematic or archetypal for shamanism, for the psychedelic experience in our time. And Alex and his wife Allison Grey are co-founders of Cosm. So welcome everybody, and welcome to Alex.
Born in Columbus, Ohio in November 1953, Alex Grey had an early fascination with death. He went to the Columbus College of Art and Design on a full scholarship, but dropped out and made a living painting billboards. Fate brought him to Boston and the Museum of Fine Arts. It was during that time that Alex met the person who would become his life partner and eventually his wife, Allison Grey. His prolific output of artwork since then has included everything from working as a medical illustrator at Harvard University to perhaps his best-known work, The Sacred Mirrors. His paintings have been featured as the album art of Tool, the Beastie Boys, and Nirvana. On top of this, his art has been featured in solo exhibitions at Feature Inc., the Tibet House, Stux Gallery, PS1, the Outsider Art Fair, the New Museum in New York City, the Grand Palais in Paris, and the Sao Paulo Biennial in Brazil. In 2011 and 2012, the Watkins Review named him one of the top 20 spiritual leaders alive, along with the Dalai Lama, Eckhart Tolle, and Oprah Winfrey.
So thank you so much for joining us on Mindshift. It's great to see you as always. And so maybe start with a little bit about your early career. Like, how does one get to be Alex Grey?
Well, I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and my dad was a commercial graphic artist, and he taught me how to draw. And I loved monsters, and I was fascinated with death, actually, and some of my earliest stuff is all skeletons and things. Now,
what was it about death that you found so interesting?
I think the cessation of life, you know, it was just what happened.
Did you have an idea of anything that would come after death, or it was just the actual...
The question of it was unsettling and draw me toward a very shadowy area, you know, and in the consideration of it. And of course, I was probably filled with fear about it, you know, what's the nature of life? And I was later on taking on a lot more existential attitude of an absurd and materialist kind of reality. You know, I was buying into the kind of reductionist worldview, and by the time I was 21, I was pretty desperate and suicidal even, and challenged the Almighty to appear if there were such a thing,
And this was when, when the 70s?
I was 75.
75.
Actually.
So you kind of were a little bit past the 60s generation.
May 30th, yeah. And and I was just getting out of art school, and I had never tripped before. And so anyway, I was saying goodbye to my professor on a street corner, and this girl drives by and invites me to her party later that evening. And the professor picks me up later that evening, and he has a bottle of Kahlua and LSD. And
Mixed together, or it's a choice, one or the other?
No, together. You know, they were in the same bottle. This was our professor, you know. And so he offered it to me, and I'd never done it before, but what the hell. So, and then I shared the other half of the bottle with the gal who was throwing the party. So anyway, that was Allison, of course. That was 38 years ago, and it was a revolution in my consciousness, you know. From a very dark person, I found the light immediately. The light of God, the light of love, was just around this kind of corner. I was in the dark and going toward the light, and it was all the shades of gray that brought the opposites together. And so I decided to change my name to Gray. And based on
I realize
that,
I don't even know what your original name was.
it was Velzy, which is a famous name for surfers, because Dale Velzy was a historic figure in shaping surfboards. But probably would have done me some good, but I changed it to Gray.
When you say you found the light and you found God, I mean, those are like huge statements. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what does that actually mean? You know?
Well, if I had bought into a kind of flatland reality that there was no creator, this was a chance occurrence that life grew in the way that it did, and just a collection of random events, basically, that led up to where we are. And even though in hindsight that seems completely unintelligent, that was my attitude, and pretty much a lot of the people that I hung out with. And it was a very cynical attitude too. And so the mystical experience kind of turns that on its head, and no longer do you imagine that reality is composed only of a material manifestation, but an equally infinite terrain of an inner world and an equally deep and profound connection with source, what feels like source reality happens. And that, in the wake of a visionary mystical experience, you're a changed person. You have a sense that a divine intelligence exists, that its basis is love, and that you are an emanation, one node of an infinitely one intelligence. And so to have a sense of that without speaking, and yet suddenly you have a sense of knowing and comprehension that transcends even your life.
No, but I have one question for you, because in the psychedelic communities that we both kind of travel in a bit, like the MAPS world and Arrowwood and so on, there are lots of people who have had profound psychedelic experiences that are visionary in a certain sense, but they don't make that jump to kind of believing there's a divine intelligence. They see it more as a manifestation of kind of our brain's capacity. What do you, I mean, I'm sure you know tons of these characters. How do you explain that they have the same experience, but they don't interpret it the same way?
Well, that they buy into a more, I guess, rationally based altitude on trying to make a call whether that's real or not. By and large, a mystical experience is just about the most important experience that people who have had them would say in their lifetime, at least on the top 5 experiences of their lifetime, you know. And for many people, it's profoundly healing. For me, it was a choice whether I was going to even to be or not to be, you know. It helped to answer that, you know.
And how old were you at that point, you said?
21.
I see. And the types of work that you're now known for, though, it was still a number of years before you kind of arrived at that kind of work.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I not only sort of found God in the light that was just around the bend, but I found God in the persona of my partner, Allison Gray, and soon to be my wife. And so the choosing to be together and to continue our psychedelic sacramental sojourns, we arrived at this space of infinite love, I think, under the influence of the sort of container of our relationship. So you talk about a proper set and setting for an opening, a mystical opening. And you would imagine being supported by those who love you, and as being strongly supportive to that. And so I think that finding Allison and working together and having dead-on matched mystical experiences of like the universal mind lattice, that was for me, that was the deciding thing. That when we had and described and started drawing the same exact mystical experience that was completely out of the body, that was an experience of the light that really changed us, and it reoriented us toward what we're doing now.
And there was at some point you came into contact also with Tibetan Buddhist traditions that had an influence also.
Oh yeah.
When was that?
Well, around 1980 or so, and 81, we developed a friendship with Ken Wilber. And so he and some other friends, Mark Epstein and folks, had introduced us to Tibetan Buddhism when I was working at a medical school in a morgue. And because they knew that I was working with the dead, and they thought that it would be good for me to get a Tibetan Book of the Dead, and they gave me a...
Also, wasn't there a particular type of Tibetan Buddhist practice that kind of related to working with corpses and that kind of interest?
Yes.
What's that called again? It was like is it Chod practice or something?
The Chud.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's a common practice for them to do that in a charnel ground or in the burial grounds. That particular practice.
You mean types of meditations or types of?
Yes, yes, and it's a way of feeding all the beings. It's a special, amazing practice. But anyway, Ken Wilber had basically said, I know you like all the spiritual paths, but chase many rabbits, catch none, so why don't you decide on one? And so I considered him a real spiritual friend and big brother, and he said, just do it, and then you'll get the fruit of the practice a little bit. And you can't, otherwise, just reading books and stuff, you're not gonna get that. If you study with a teacher, though, and really hang out with them and get their transmissions and do the practices, then you learn something about the tradition. And it's, been hugely, deeply impactful.
So is that is an ongoing practice for you?
Yes, but it's also, the Dzogchen non-dual tradition would have you embracing whatever you're doing as part of your contemplation and your path, and to not see a difference so much between meditation or contemplation and your everyday life. You know, not such
As long as you can
break.
stay in some kind of non-attachment or witness consciousness or some state.
That's the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I'm not saying I'm there, but it still informs that part of my practice, and I, you know, do go over the basics, you know. And Norbu is just Namkhai Norbu is just an amazing teacher, and he was really important for our spiritual development.
Let's talk a little bit about LSD as a creative tool. I mean, you know, obviously LSD is still very much suppressed in our culture, and in a sense, you've been, you know, courageous as a kind of outspoken advocate for that kind of experience. What do you think about LSD? I mean, do you think there are, you know, are there dangers to it, or is there a value to it? Like, what's kind of its, you know, obviously it erupted in the mid-century into the modern Western psyche, discovered by Albert Hofmann. Like, what is this stuff? You know.
Well, of course, my interpretation of LSD, which is celebrating 70 years of age this past April, in April 19th, 1943, when Albert Hofmann took the first dose. I feel like it was a historic and transcendental moment for humanity. I think of it as a religious moment. I think that Albert heard an angel calling him to mix up LSD because it caused a consciousness revolution that we're still in, you know, the waves and paroxysms of. What it did was to bring actual sacrament back to the human experience of, you know, westernized white people that believe in science, no longer religion, you know. And anybody who has visions is obviously hallucinating and perhaps psychotic, maybe ought to be locked up. And so in that kind of world, when Hofmann, a scientist, brings forward sacrament that electrifies the mind and opens us up to actual God consciousness, even if it's just a glimpse. You know, the miracle of the psychedelic sacrament is something that has been known about, of course, for millennia, you know, and it was at the actual cradle of both Eastern and Western civilization, and is certainly so important to the Aztec and Mayan culture as well. Actually, the old-time religion was a sacramental religion. And it being at such a...
You're talking about what, you know, I mean, of course, these are theories maybe that aren't...
No.
So you're
this
talking
is
about,
science.
Like,
this
you're
is
talking
science.
About the mysteries
so
of Eleusis.
The Kykeon, the Greek mysteries, it was the state religion. For over 1,000 years, there was a psychedelic culture. You know, that's how Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, all of them
but we don't know,
tripping.
We don't know exactly what the components were of that potion.
No, but it was obviously a way to connect them with the divine. In the same way that soma was a plant sacrament that allowed the practitioners to connect with the divine reality. Mm-hmm. So we have soma and the Kykeon, two sacraments at the cradle of Eastern and Western civilization. So it was a sacramental religion, and it was a real sacrament. That is, it got you to a state of connection with sacred reality. And so I think that with the reemergence of LSD and that leading then to the psilocybin from Gordon Wasson and Maria Sabina, the connection with the Central and South American traditions and all the rest of this. This is bringing forward actual sacrament again, which humanity, except for the last few hundred years, it's been suppressed. You know,
and what's been the influence of these experiences for you on your art? Like, I mean, it seems as if in your work you paint, you know, kind of energy bodies, chakra systems. Are these all things that you've clearly visualized during visionary states?
Yes, and some of them are more adaptations and adoptions of some of the light body yogic material. You know, I don't know every acupuncture meridian and point, you know, just in my memory and things like that. But I try to weave in both Eastern and Western medical understanding about the body. So it's trying to remap our understanding of that there is a subtle energetic system in our you know, that is part of our body, a subtle body as well.
I wanted to ask you why, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I would say that your work is not taken seriously in like the canonical mainstream art world. On the other hand, it's been such an inspiration, especially for young people, kind of like a global youth culture. How do you see that dichotomy and what do you feel about that?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon. I think it's an actual phenomena because worldwide, there's festival culture. You're frequently we meet you on the road, you know, in Timbuktu or Australia or wherever, and so all over the world there are tripping young people who appear at festivals, have an enormous amount of fun and inspiration together. And this is the visionary art phenomena has been bonded with this festival culture and with millions of people worldwide. And so I'm seeing it in some ways as a kind of folk art of this tribe, which we've loosely called the Love Tribe, just to, because it is an expression of a commonly understood consciousness. And as an expression of this special and sacramental consciousness, it's united like a kind of sacred art with a population and a community. And so, and in some ways, because, you know, people have been tattooed all over with my artwork, and in some ways, does that not stand up to a New York Times
you don't go after
review or something
you don't
like
go after
that?
copyright infringement if they got the tattoos?
No, we let them do that. You know, it's awesome. You know, I mean, it's like it's a walking kind of testimonial for the impact of the work. And it's mostly people who have been validated in their own sacramental journeying by the visionary art. And that's why there's a connection between the community for whom it matters. And I would argue that it's also connected with the emergence of a planetary civilization, because it's happening worldwide. It's a return to the sacrament that was at the foundation of both Eastern and Western civilization. And we're looking for a mystic core for a planetary civilization. Because where else are we going? We're kind of already there in some people's global citizenry, you know, but more and more the internet is interconnecting us. And I think that it's a very exciting time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this little dialogue. And we will be right back with Michael Muhammad Knight, author of Tripping with Allah, and then we'll have Alex back on to have a little trialogue with Michael. So thank you so much.
After a troubled childhood, Michael Muhammad Knight converted to Islam at the age of 15, and at 17 went to Islamabad, Pakistan to study the religion. In 2002, Knight wrote The Taqwa Course, about a Muslim punk rock group. Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina, Carl W. Ernst, called the novel The Catcher in the Rye for young Muslims. The book also spawned a filmed adaptation and the start of a Muslim punk scene in the United States. His most recent book, Tripping with Allah, Islam, Drugs, and Writing, details his experiences from an Islamic point of view with the shamanic medicine ayahuasca. The San Francisco Chronicle describes him as one of the most necessary and, paradoxically enough, hopeful writers of Barack Obama's America.
Hey there, welcome back. This is Mindshift with Daniel Pinchbeck, and I'm here with Michael Muhammad Knight. Great to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, Michael, so you're prolific. You've written numerous tomes of various lengths. Tell me a little bit about your introduction to Islam and how you kind of ended up taking this path.
Well, I'm kind of a weird guy, and it starts when I was like 15. A really mixed up kid writing letters to Charles Manson, and he wrote back, by the way. So I was like Charles Manson's pen pal at one point. At the same time, I got into Malcolm X, and this is like the time in the early '90s when Malcolm X's presence in pop culture was just all over the place. Like I think Bill Clinton wore an X hat when he was running. Like it was at that level, and there were a lot of like Malcolm X references in hip hop, and just being just a really wounded kind of angst-ridden, 15-year-old. Upstate New York, yep, Finger Lakes area. I was looking for a way to rebuild myself and not be the 15-year-old kid who writes letters to Charles Manson. And Malcolm promised me something, a way of reconstructing myself, a way of constructing a certain kind of masculinity. And because Islam was the portal through which he found himself, naturally I kind of gravitated towards Islam. And when I was 16, I went to a mosque and officially, became Muslim. And 2 months of my senior year in high school, I was at a madrasa in Pakistan studying Islam.
And how frequent? I mean, how often do people? Are you from like a Christian background or white Christian?
Yeah.
background? I mean, is that frequent that people are from that type of background are jumping into Islam right now?
Yeah, I grew up Catholic, kind of nominally Catholic, and I thought that my story was really strange at the time. In the years since, as I've kind of traveled and put my own story out there, I have run into a lot of people who, at that particular moment in American history, found Malcolm X, found the kind of secret Islamic component of hip hop, and went on similar paths as mine, with the various ups and downs, and very kind of zealous conversions, kind of heartbreaking disillusionments, and the in-between spaces too.
And we went to Pakistan, and ultimately you got involved with a Sufi order, is that correct?
In the course of my travels, I've had intersections with Sufism. There's an Iranian Sufi order that I took initiation into, and I've dabbled in various other kinds of expressions of Sufism. But Sufism is kind of a big construct. So there's a lot of stuff in it, and I've done a little bit of wandering in it, yeah.
Well, I guess just from my perspective, not knowing too much, I see Sufism as more like the esoteric aspect of Islam, kind of like maybe Kabbalah is for Christianity or something like that.
That's certainly there. There's also Sufis who are very kind of Sharia compliant, very kind of rigid in their and disciplined in their practices too. So there's a wide spectrum within Sufi tradition. I mean, there were Sufi groups in certain times and places in history where they would walk around naked and spread ashes on their bodies and smoke weed all day. And
like the sadhus in India.
Yeah. I mean, Islam intersected with all these different things. So Islamic tradition in a broader sense and what we call Sufism, and more specifically, has taken on all kinds of different shapes.
So tell me a little bit more about so what's I guess Islam often has a very negative connotation in mainstream culture in the U.S. As somebody who's kind of delved deeply and penetrated deeply into it, like, can you explicate your own impressions and what you've kind of discovered in your path?
Well, my answer is always kind of the deconstructive move, because there are people who would claim a particular essence for Islam as being the most rigid and intolerant and and legally oriented and blindly ritualistic and misogynistic kind of tradition, and that this is something constant and unchanging throughout history. And then there's people who, justifiably so, take exception to that kind of essentialism, and they construct a counter essence, that Islam has always been liberatory and beautiful and poetic and wonderful.
Who's an example of the second?
There's all kinds of reformist voices, and not just public intellectuals, but just everyday Muslims trying to relocate what Islam means for them. Mm-hmm. So people might pull towards, Sufi tradition is often a means that people create this counter essence, referring to people like Rumi or Hallaj or Ibn al-Arabi, people like that. But for me, it's all Islam. It's all Islamic tradition. So I don't claim an essence. I don't claim that there's this one unchanging character to Islam. And that bothers a lot of people because they want there to be this of course we know what Islam is. It's very evident what Islam is.
Well, some people have argued that fundamentalism in general is more of a postmodern phenomenon. That the kind of rigid constructs in Christian evangelical fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism are more like things that happen as a result of kind of modern progress and the kind of pop media and all this kind of stuff that then forced kind of these groups to construct a kind of more rigid identity.
Sure. There's a couple things that have been happening. In the late 19th century, we can look at what Buddhists were doing. And Japanese Buddhist thinkers saying we need to get rid of all these cultural accumulations and return to the true Buddhism of the Buddha and wash away all these superstitions and folk religious type things. And Hindus are saying the same thing at the same time and place, or different places. And Muslims were doing that too. Muslims were saying we need to separate true, pure, original Islam from all these different cultural expressions of Islam. And we need to go back to what the Prophet originally brought. So they're all doing kind of the same thing, in different ways. So it very much, ironically, the call to go back to the origins and shed all of this cultural accumulation, it's part of its time and place.
And in some of your books, it seems like actually you do identify a lot with the figure of Muhammad himself. You discuss him a lot in the recent book, Tripping with Allah, which obviously is one that is germane to my interests. So can you explain to me a little bit about how you consider Muhammad to be kind of an important figure for you at this point in time?
I've had a very long and complex relationship to Muhammad just because people make so many different choices in how they represent him. Mm-hmm. So part of my own journey, and it's taken a long time and a lot of books to kind of work this out for myself, was finding Muhammad as kind of a visualization of my ideal, not my ideal self, but a self to strive towards. Not that I could reach that, but just an idea of a perfect humanity.
What qualities of Muhammad do you find have that?
Just his kindness, his patience, his care, and the way that he becomes kind of a template for myself. That I can look at stories of how he treated people and see that as something that I can attain towards and something that I don't live up to. For example, just a story as simple as he was in the mosque and there's a Bedouin who walks into the mosque and doesn't understand, Muhammad's concept of modesty and even basic hygiene and cleanliness, that the Bedouin just starts urinating in the middle of the mosque. And people are ready to kill him, like all the Prophet's companions who understand, how Muhammad felt about these kinds of things. They want to kill this man. And Muhammad's like, just, let him go. Just pour water on it. It'll be fine. Just let him go. He doesn't know what he's doing. Just let him go. And, in my life and in all of our experiences, we can find people who are kind of pissing on the things that we find sacred. This was a mosque. This man's pissing in the mosque. And Muhammad gave better care to that man than I generally do when people piss on the things that I care about. And similarly, I've written a lot of controversial things and offensive things, and I've found Muslims acting out that story with me, because in some of the things that I say, I'm basically urinating in the mosque. I'm taking things that people care about, and I'm really challenging them, and sometimes very, disrespectfully and provocatively so. And there are people who still call me their brother after that experience. So I say, that's how I should be living out the example of Muhammad.
What are some examples of these areas that are so controversial that you delve into?
Part of it's the person of Muhammad himself. Mm-hmm. because there are a lot of different stories about Muhammad. They're not all flattering. They're not all positive. There's a lot of different ways that people choose to wrestle with those stories. But at different times in my life, I would kind of take the punk, we'll tear everything down, and he's like kind of the big patriarch, and I'm doing this murder of the father kind of thing with him. And a lot of people take offense to that because he is someone who's very dear to people.
Oh, well, let's, I'm super psyched to get into your, well, let's start with that, actually. So tell me a little bit about what drew you to ayahuasca and how you kind of, how you felt that you could kind of, synthesize that interest with Islam in some sense,
Well, it's partly what I needed at the particular time. I have a long story with Islam, my life as a Muslim. And I've had experiences that I would consider to be profoundly spiritual, even approaching visionary experiences. And then, I went on this. Well, for example, I went to Mecca in 2008, and there is an immense sensory overload, in the experience of going to Mecca. Just the masses of people and the, imagery.
Just for people who don't know, my understanding is the Kaaba itself, the rock, is a meteorite. Is that correct?
I don't think we're ever going to have the opportunity to put it under scientific, examination like that, but that's what's been theorized. Just because the narrative is that the stone comes from heaven. So I think people have kind of suggested, well, if this was a stone that people experienced at one time as coming from the sky, then it was most likely a meteorite.
And everybody moves around it obviously in a certain direction. Which is
yeah, there's a ritual called tawaf where people walk around the Kaaba, which houses the stone.
And is there an esoteric understanding of what, of a kind of future condition that results from this kind of constant practice of putting energy towards this particular manifestation?
I would say that there's been a wide variety of interpretations, and there are people who do esoteric interpretations of it. The main thing for me, as I've engaged the pilgrimage, was that it's just something that you need to do. Like, this is part of the life of a Muslim. And for me particularly, it's part of walking in Muhammad's footsteps. And it's not just an experience of the individual with God, because and people do, obviously they go to Mecca and they seek that encounter with God, that direct experience of the divine. But one thing I was looking for was an experience with people, that I'm a Muslim and I have this very angsty, alienated relationship to many Muslim communities and many people in those communities, and I'm trying to find myself as a Muslim on this planet, in my own lifetime. So part of the experience of Mecca for me was reconciling myself to the extreme diversity, the vast, diversity of Muslims, because there's a lot of good in that and there's a lot of problems, as with any tradition.
But to a certain extent, it was something you experienced subjectively as a visionary or a mystical, or it had that dimension to it?
It wasn't walking around the Kaaba itself. There's a lot of off times, because I was there for 3 weeks. So there were times when I'm in the mass complex that the Saudi state is built around the Kaaba. There's escalators and all kinds of ceiling fans, and it's a very modern kind of construction. And I would just sit on the cool marble floor at night and just kind of space out. And in the context of spacing out in this place that I have internalized as a sacred place, I did let my thoughts kind of go. And it's not a hallucination or something where I'm losing awareness of where I am, but I am kind of going into places in my head. And part of that was these kind of encounters with Ishmael, the son of Abraham, who was central to the story of the Kaaba. So I had those kinds of experiences at the Kaaba and at other places. And then I kind of go into grad school and I start studying religion in a very academic way, and that cuts off. So what I was looking for with ayahuasca was kind of a way to get that up again, to kind of be more engaged from the gut.
And in the book, you go over the whole history of the relationship between Islam and all sorts of different drugs and psychoactives and so on. And did that, that research in a way provide kind of like a safe ground, foundation for you to then have that type of exploration?
Absolutely, because the first question for a project about Islam and drugs is, well, what does Islam say about drugs? What does the Quran say? What does the Prophet say? And just kind of destabilizing the answers that people give to those questions allowed me a little bit of space to engage it myself and to find my own answer, really.
And so tell me a little bit about your encounters with ayahuasca.
I had 3. The first was very kind of unfulfilling.
That was with the Daime?
Yeah, I went with the Santo Daime, and they were very nice people.
Santo Daime is a religion from Brazil that uses ayahuasca as a sacrament. It's kind of a syncretic mixture of Christian and Indian elements.
And they were very welcoming. I have nothing but positive things to say about the people who kind of opened that door for me. But I am very much a Muslim, and my symbolic language that I've internalized and that I think in is a Muslim language. So, you know, when I'm going to this Daime ceremony, and it's very, very explicitly Christian, you know, there's pictures of Jesus, and we're singing, you know, kind of Christian hymns in Portuguese and stuff, and I couldn't make that work for me. You know, I couldn't.
It sounds like it wasn't such strong medicine also.
Yeah, that there might have been that aspect too. But I just couldn't. I couldn't make it my own. And then my second time trying it, I didn't have the DMT agent. You know, I'm just drinking the vine itself. And that was at a counterterrorism.
It's a great opportunity to vomit a lot.
Yeah, well, that didn't even end up happening. I'm at a counterterrorism conference, and I have the vine, and like I go during the breaks between panels, and I have like the hot coffee maker, and I pour the hot water in, and I'm just kind of like vibing out with all these CIA agents.
Very Hunter S. Thompson of you.
Well, that's what they say. Yeah, so I didn't have, I had a good time. Like I went back into my room that they gave me, and I'm just kind of vibing out. But the third time was at a ceremony in Southern California, and it was with kind of a classically trained shaman, they would have said. And there was no kind of doctrinal component to it that I had to sign on to. In other words, there's no very, like, we're Christian and you're doing a Christian thing here. There's no kind of shared singing, anything like that. It's you go up to the shaman and he gives you your medicine, and then you just go back into your corner and you have your sleeping bag and your bucket in case you need it, and you just close your eyes and you're just there. And then there's some kind of, like there's breathing and there's the music and stuff. But that's what I need it to be.
Well, it sounded like from the book you had a profound visionary experience in that setting.
Yeah, and in terms of, I don't like words like orthodoxy and heterodoxy and heresy and stuff, but it was off the chart heterodox, heretical. Part of what I went into it expecting or trying to prepare for was an encounter with the divine in feminine form. I had been led to expect that this kind of happens a lot with people drinking the medicine. And so, being a Muslim and trying to find a way into that, I looked to Muhammad's daughter Fatima as my window through to that. So I have with me dust from Karbala in Iraq, where Fatima's son, the Prophet's grandson, was brutally murdered. And I ingest that dust. So I'm ingesting the blood of Fatima's son, Hussein, before I take the medicine. And so there's this kind of, this is how I'm prepping myself, And I just say, Rabbi zidni ilma, Allah, my Lord, increase me in knowledge, and I just go vibe out, and I have my encounter with Fatima. And I'm not committed to the idea that this is something outside of me coming, beaming down to me or anything like that. But yeah, I had my encounter with Fatima.
And it had a whole sexual dimension to it.
There was. I feel like there was a purging of kind of masculinist poison and just, not just exclusively Muslim masculinity, but just growing up a boy in America and ingesting that kind of masculinity also. And it comes through the form of Fatima, and not only do I have these very kind of explicit encounter with Fatima herself, but I become Fatima at one point. And as Fatima, I have sex with Ali, her husband, who was extraordinarily important in Islamic tradition. And I'm experiencing kind of a superior masculinity in Ali, as Fatima. And with Fatima, when I'm myself, she's naked, and she tells me that, she kind of puts my hand on her and says that this is the door to the mosque. All the masculinist religious stuff, the books and the legal traditions and the mosques and all that, it's just trying to replicate the womb. Like, this is the real power. This is where the mosque is. And so just that kind of, that experience, there was a lot of purging of boy pain,
Why didn't you, why didn't you continue with ayahuasca after that?
Part of it's just a matter of the portals that I have access to. Like, I'm open to it, I'm not against it. I had an extraordinary experience with it. I'm not opposed to doing it again.
Yeah, there's a sense that the visionary experience always threatens any construct of a religion or any structure that anybody is trying to hold, because it's like this upsurge from this transcendental domain. Do you feel there's like a concern there that a path like ayahuasca might ultimately shake down certain structures?
Absolutely, because people want their religious bodies to be consistent. We want to be able to make an argument using our shared text, that we're all referring to, and to argue rationally about what the words say. Does these questions that are always thrown at Islam? Does the Quran advocate violence? Does the Quran advocate misogynist patriarchy? All these kinds of questions. We want to be able to go to the book and flip through it and find a verse and prove rationally using the text that the text says something. And absolutely, this medicine and other kinds of experiences like that destabilize that, because you have a source outside of the text, or a new filter, a new lens through which you're reading the text. So there's definitely that component of kind of tearing apart the construction that we're building with.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Michael. It was great to talk to you.
It was a good
And
time.
we got a lot more we can dive into it. So we'll be right back with Alex and Michael. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Daniel Pinchbeck. We're here with Mindshift, and I'm here with Alex Gray and Michael Muhammad Knight. And I thought it was kind of a unique and interesting opportunity to discuss psychedelics and religion, the future of religion, perhaps. So I know you guys met backstage, and we were discussing kind of, is there an opportunity to kind of revitalize kind of the traditional religious institutions with the type of sacramental visionary experience that sort of erupted back in the consciousness of the modern West over the later half of the 20th century and into today. So I'll throw that out to you guys, and be curious to hear your different perspectives.
Well, in a conversation with an ayahuasca user who, with their group, experienced being in the Jewish temple, where they also were, had participated and were part of that community. They were able to use the temple, and it conferred an entirely new heart connection with the mystic core of their tradition. And that was because of the sacred context, I think, that was supporting that connection. And of course, their complete attitude of taking in the sacred context and
Right.
specifically doing it there. So there's the possibility
Right.
that a true sacrament that would wake people up to divinity, which is at the core of all world wisdom traditions, might reignite or renew a kind of mystic connection.
Yeah, just to back up a little bit, just to go over a little bit of the history of ayahuasca. So in the 60s, in the late 60s and 70s, all the psychedelic compounds were made highly legal and categorized as Schedule 1. Peyote, however, had an exemption with the Native American Church that the Supreme Court tried to take away from them, I think in the early 90s, and tried to make it totally a state-by-state issue. But this led to kind of an uproar, as I remember, and Congress was kind of pressured to issue an Emergency Religious Freedom Proclamation Act, which protected the use of peyote by roadmen from the Native American Church. And then that was used as a precedent for ayahuasca. First of all, a religion, there's two main syncretic religions from Brazil that use ayahuasca as a sacrament, União de Vegetalis and Santo Daime. And the UDV managed to win a Supreme Court case protecting use of their sacrament. So there's now chapters of the UDV that are legally sanctioned opening up in different cities in the US. And the second church, Santo Daime, which is the one that I've experienced, and it sounds like you also, and maybe you as well.
UDV.
Okay, they've won a major federal case in Oregon, and it seems likely that or possible anyway, that practice could also become protected. Just to give you a little background and context where we're at now. So what are your thoughts about, could there be an entheogenic reformation or regeneration of traditional religious structures like Islam?
I mean, speaking just purely, from my own experience, the day after my intense encounter with the medicine, when I had my Fatima vision and all of that, the next day I went to the mosque, and the medicine's still in there. I didn't throw up, it didn't come out the other end, and I'm doing everything by the book. I'm going in there with all appearances of a more or less conservative Muslim. My internal understanding and the way I'm processing it might be different. So even if it's something that was wildly subversive and heretical and challenging to what my sisters and brothers in the mosque would have seen as legitimate, the medicine still actually connected me to them in new ways. And then after I came back home, I was going to pretty conservative mosques and just reading it differently, just feeling it differently. So I think, as different people encounter this and kind of run it through their own lives, something can definitely happen. I don't know if it's a revitalization of tradition. I mean, I think it'll be something new, because we're all kind of swimming in the fishbowl of our time and place. So it will be something that's rooted in our own experience and not just things that came before us. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for things to happen.
I was interested when you discussed your ayahuasca experience that you said it was very much an experience of the divine feminine, because obviously in terms of contemporary critiques of Islam, one of the main common complaints about it is this sense of that women are quite subjugated, or their role is quite secondary in the religion. And what we're seeing in the contemporary psychedelic world is very much kind of this construct of the return of the divine feminine. So I thought maybe it would be interesting for both of you to sort of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I wouldn't pinpoint Islam as being the one religion that gets gender wrong, because not only is Islam historically unstable itself, but certainly Christianity and South Asian religion traditions and Buddhism, everything has some kind of gender issue. But absolutely, I was interested in the medicine as purging some of my masculine stuff. Not just from my Muslim experience, but being an American boy raised on pro wrestling and G.I. Joe and He-Man and all of that. But yeah, I was looking at Fatima as being a feminine voice, because the Quran, it does to me.
I mean, there are some distinctions, I would think, between the way the subjugation of the feminine or women in Judeo-Christian cultures and Islam. There people would make some distinctions, no?
I mean, again, I wouldn't speak to Islam as being a singular construct or this separate Judeo-Christian kind of thing either, but.
Well, is there an example within Islam of a subculture where the feminine and the masculine are more perfectly balanced?
I don't know if that exists anywhere in Islam or not. But for me, as a reader of the Quran, my eyes and my ears, I find the Quran speaking with a male voice. And that was an issue for me. I wanted to see if there could be a space for a feminine voice. And so during my vision, my encounter, vision isn't always the right word, because it wasn't just my eyes or even my eyes, but I asked Fatima, I was like, what about the Quran? The Quran says this and this and this. What do I do with that? And she says, that's for the boys. The Quran's for the boys. You just stay with me. The Quran is for the boys. You just stick with me now. And that was an Islamic experience for me. It wasn't a textual. She was walking me away from the text for a moment, but to me, like, I'm a Muslim experiencing.
But how do you situate that experience in terms of, like, would you say that was, from your perspective, was that a divine encounter, or was that an act of creative imagination where you were kind of like, in a sense, making up a script, and then the astral, energies were allowing you to kind of build that script up into some kind of direct perception?
It could be both, and I'm not. Like I say, I'm not committed to the idea that it has to have come from outside of me to be worthwhile for me. But in terms of trying to contextualize it within the Islamic tradition, going back to Ibn al-Arabi, also Ibn al-Arabi saw Allah's attributes, not manifesting might be the wrong word, but expressed through creation, and there is a gender component to that. And Ibn al-Arabi said that, or he taught that men and women could recognize Allah in each other. Different attributes. And that there's a story of the Prophet. The Prophet said, the best of you, speaking to men, the best of you is the one who's best to his wife, and I'm the best of you because I'm the best to my wives. And Ibn Arabi said that's because he saw kind of the divine attributes in his wives. That
how many did he have again?
There's debate. There's debate about that because there's questions of what constitutes a wife, and
5 to 10, 15 to 20.
Not 20, but there are different estimates.
What about your thoughts on that sort of divine feminine reemergence and how maybe that plays a part?
In reading Ibn Arabi again, there is a discussion of the divine feminine as kind of the creatrix. And as you were saying, the gender bias of creative imagination might be toward the divine feminine because it's a birthplace of new insight and transformation. The creative imagination is like evolution in process, and spirit is genderless or beyond gender, but it's also coming into form. And in our visions, it's a way of the symbolic imagination and infinite interdimensional nodes to come forward in a moment, in an icon. And this is what the sacrament does. It allows people to have contact with this iconic, visionary dimension. And so the symbolism, whether it was purely coming up in the magic 8-ball of your unconscious, superconsciousness, ultimately, what you're also learning is that we're all interconnected. So it's pretty hard to draw those boundaries exactly. And so there's infusions of energies of all kinds, and the divine feminine becomes a symbol of balance for our era of over paternalizing, so that rise of the feminine is something that is an evolutionary force. The equalization or the harmonization and union of the opposites is ultimately the way our species and all healing takes place. Is the coming together of opposites.
Something in what I heard you speaking about made me remember my kind of, in a sense, pessimism about religion as a forward-going construct for humanity, and that it seems like there's always the visionary experience, the upsurge of that, and then that needs to take a form or a structure, which then kind of tends to blockade or obstruct like the next wave that wants to obliterate that structure and start again. So could you construct theoretically a religion or a form of esoteric expression that allowed for this constant transmutation or transformation?
I think there's a lot of possibilities, and certainly religion itself is not an historically stable construct in the sense that there's always been this thing called
Neither
religion.
is history.
Right, sure, absolutely. So I think that absolutely, as more and more people are dissatisfied with how religion is often conceptualized as this kind of organized, self-contained entity with very clear rules and regulations and hierarchies. Certainly there's a lot of people who don't want that. And they want something.
Yeah, you actually wrote about that a little bit, that Islam in itself, I mean, you could be, in earlier phases, you could be Hindu and Islam and Buddhist and Islam, like these things kind of interpenetrated.
Well, there's certain times and places, for example, colonial South Asia, when the British would take a census in a particular region to see who was Hindu, who was Muslim, and the numbers would add up to more than 100%. Because people just didn't understand religion, or they didn't conceptualize religion in the way that Western Europeans did. That you of course you can't be Muslim and Hindu, that makes no rational sense. People didn't necessarily conceptualize it that way, and there were people in South Asia who saw Ali, Fatima's husband, as Vishnu. They saw that as the same entity, and there was no kind of illogical problem with that.
So we'd be better off making less rational sense.
I don't know that it's less rational. I mean, it didn't satisfy a certain idea of rationality.
Absolutely, I get what you're saying. Cool.
It's a visionary logic.
Yeah, and very quickly, I wanted to maybe touch on, in our last few minutes here, kind of art, counterculture. I know you've written about William Burroughs, and you kind of came out of kind of the 70s performance art, kind of edge of transgressive performance and so on. Like, what do you see? Do you see active countercultures now, and what do you see the value of those types of more transgressive expressions?
I think that the shadow will always have a forum. Right now, the corporate media, I think, is a dominant shadow force. So the alternative media forces will find unique little pockets of minds who are trying to, undo the shackles of corporate shrill advertising and selling us on fear and death. Mm-hmm. And so the yes, there are also numerous artists who will continue to engage that, and I think all of these are necessary. Mm-hmm. We have to address and continually examine our shadow element, but to focus only on it mm-hmm. is to short the other side of the coin, is to say that there is no heaven, there's only hell. And I think that a media that points toward the internal infinite and the thing that binds the different world wisdom traditions. This is what we're looking for in the future, is a universal kind of spirituality. And this is why the Dalai Lama was promoting mm-hmm. that idea.
What about you? How would you see it?
I want to be more optimistic than I am. I mean, I'm
optimistic about what?
About the potential for spaces and kind of being productive in the shadows. Mm-hmm. This thing we call Islam that we think is stable and consistent and very, by the book throughout time. That there are shadows within that, and that you could be in the shadows of Islam and in the shadows of quote unquote the West, and that there's a lot of space for creativity and personal autonomy in that.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. It's great to have you here on Mindshift, and I hope you guys will both come back and visit us again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Daniel.